Okay, so, as someone who's into philosophy, you've probably come across all these thinkers, the kind who were like super influential back in the day. But then, well, their impact kind of faded over time.
Yeah, totally. It's like if their ideas lost their shine, I guess.
Right. And today we're going to dive deep into one of those guys, Petrus Ramus. He lived from 1515 to 1572. And I'm guessing he's probably not like a household name anymore.
Not exactly a dinner table conversation starter these days.
But here's the thing. In his time, Ramus sparked these like really heated debates. And get this, he actually managed to leave a lasting mark on university courses across Europe. Like, how crazy is that? And that's what we're here to figure out, like, why?
Yeah, it's actually a pretty interesting puzzle, right? I mean, this guy, he had tons of followers and changed how education worked in a big way. But when you look at what scholars say now, they kind of question, like, how original his ideas really were.
Hmm.
I mean, Walter Ong, he's a pretty big name, right? He even said that those popular logic books Ramus wrote, well, they could in no real sense be considered an advance or even a reform. So for a philosopher, that raises a big question, doesn't it? How did someone who some people see as, not that original end up having such a huge impact?
Yeah, exactly. And that's like the whole point of our deep dive today. We're going to try and unravel why this philosopher, who maybe wasn't so groundbreaking, managed to shake things up so much. What was it about his critiques of the status quo that really struck a chord with people back then? And to do this, we're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Petrus Ramus.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, it's super comprehensive. And the cool thing is, it gives us all sorts of perspectives from people who are like totally on board with his ideas to those who are, pretty critical.
Hmm.
So our goal is to understand why he mattered, even if it was more about his influence on things than about coming up with some brand new philosophy.
And that distinction is something that any philosopher should appreciate, right? Influence and originality, they're often connected, but they're separate things in the grand scheme of ideas.
Totally. Okay, so let's start by like placing Ramus in the right context. You know, the intellectual and social scene of the 16th century.
Hmm.
It was a time of massive change, like seriously huge
Oh,
upheavals.
yeah, absolutely. The Reformation was happening, right? And all these new European states were consolidating power. It was a really intense time.
Right. It's like everything was being turned upside down. And Ramus, he wasn't just some bystander watching all this unfold. He was right in the thick of it.
Oh, yeah, he was totally involved. Like his conversion to Huguenot Protestantism, that wasn't just him thinking about different ideas. It was uh, deeply personal, you
Mm.
know? And ultimately, it cost him his life during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. I mean, he became a symbol of the religious conflicts that were tearing Europe apart.
Yeah, exactly. And it was against this backdrop of like intense religious and political change that Ramus was fighting this intellectual battle. He
Yeah.
was going up against scholasticism, that whole medieval system of philosophy and theology based on Aristotle. And he was challenging how it was being interpreted in the universities. He was more into a humanist approach, where rhetoric and language were super important.
But here's the thing for you as a philosopher. It's important to see that his anti-scholasticism, it wasn't like a complete break. Some scholars say that Ramus was actually more influenced by the scholastic tradition than it seems at first glance. His reforms, yeah, they were big, but they didn't really create a whole new philosophical system out of thin air. It was more like he was reshaping things that already existed.
I see what you mean, like renovating an old building instead of building a brand new one.
Exactly. That's a really good way to put it.
So now let's dive into the life story of this reformer guy. Ramus, he didn't come from a fancy background. I mean, he was born poor, his dad died when he was young, and he even had to work all sorts of jobs to pay for his studies at the University of Paris. There's this story, right, from his friend Nancilius about how dedicated he was to his studies. He was apparently sleeping like only 3 hours a night, and sadly, it ended up causing a pretty bad eye problem for him.
Oh, wow. That's rough.
I know, right? And,
Yeah.
for someone who's thinking about philosophy and how we learn, you can't help but see a connection there. Like between his own tough journey and how passionate he became about making education more accessible.
Absolutely. It seems like his own struggles probably made him want to break down barriers to knowledge. And, his problems with the University of Paris, they started right away. He just wasn't happy with the way they taught things. He thought it was all convoluted and inefficient, totally different from his own, like, super disciplined approach.
And his early tries to change things. Well, let's just say they didn't go over too well. Those first textbooks he wrote, Aristotelicae Animadversiones and Dialecticae Institutiones, they were literally censored and banned. And he wasn't even allowed to teach logic and rhetoric for a while.
Wow, they really shut him
They
down.
did. It just shows you how powerful tradition can be in academia. But then things started to change for him when he was appointed as a Regius Professor in 1551.
Oh, royal professorship. That's a big deal.
It was. Those positions, they were more independent from the university and more aligned with humanist principles. And it gave him a platform to speak out. He was making fun of the old rules for pronouncing Latin and Greek. He questioned the value of formal logic if it wasn't useful in real life, and he pushed for some pretty radical educational reforms, like he thought professors should be paid with public funds, that craftsmen should have access to education, and that merit should matter more than your family background.
Those were some seriously revolutionary ideas back then.
They were. And on top of all that, he was a writing machine. He wrote, like, over 50 books. Oh, and we can't forget about his buddy, Omar Talon. They were super tight intellectually, so much so that sometimes it's hard to tell who wrote what. Like, Talon's Rhetorica, it's basically just a revised version of Ramus's work on the same topic. When
Yeah.
Talon died in 1562, it must have been a huge loss for Ramus.
A real blow, both personally and intellectually.
So then, in 1561, he converts to Protestantism. And that, as you can imagine, was a game changer.
Yeah, big consequences.
He loses the support of this powerful cardinal, the Cardinal of Lorraine, and has to get out of Paris. He ends up spending years in Germany and Switzerland, trying to get teaching gigs in Heidelberg and Strasbourg, but no luck. Finally, he comes back to Paris in 1570, but he still can't officially teach at the university.
So even after all that, he was still being shut out.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the Catholics who gave him a hard time. Even within the Reformed Church, Ramus was stirring up trouble. He sided with the Congregationalists against the Presbyterians, and even disagreed publicly with Theodore Beza, who took over from Calvin. It shows just how independent and sometimes confrontational he was.
Yeah, he definitely wasn't afraid to speak his mind. Even if it ruffled some feathers, it probably gained him both fans and enemies.
Oh, for sure. And then we come to his death, which was pretty dramatic. He was murdered during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, even though he had protection orders from the king. His friend Nancilius, he gives us these interesting details about Ramus. He had dark skin, a huge beard that he was super proud of. He was moderate in his eating and drinking, didn't bathe much, and had a quick temper. He was even known to hit students sometimes.
Wow, that's a pretty vivid picture.
I know, right? But even with all that, he still had a lot of devoted followers.
And here's another interesting thing. He ended up making a decent amount of money, and in his will, he set up a mathematics chair that wasn't under the control of the University of Paris. Talk about a final jab.
Yeah, a real statement about his commitment to educational freedom. So, we've talked about his life, but now let's get to his actual philosophy. And for you, as a philosopher, it's important to understand why some later scholars were, well, not so impressed.
Yeah, like those guys we mentioned, Prantl and Ong.
Right, they really questioned how deep his thinking was. Ong even said his logic books weren't a step forward. So why did he have such a big impact? Well, Ramus himself said his main goal was to take Aristotle's Organon, that's Aristotle's works on logic, and make it useful for learning. He saw that the old medieval curriculum wasn't working anymore, especially for students going into the church or the government.
He was all about making education efficient and practical, right? Exactly. He even took Virgil's motto, relentless work overcomes everything. He thought students were wasting way too much time learning stuff they'd never use. And he wanted to make education cheaper and faster, especially for people who weren't rich. That connects to some really fundamental questions in philosophy about who gets to learn and how.
Right, and that focus on practicality led to his famous anti-Aristotelianism, though, as we said, it was more complex than just rejecting Aristotle outright.
Oh yeah, it wasn't a simple Aristotle is wrong thing.
He did supposedly say in a debate in 1536 that everything Aristotle had said was false, though probably exaggerated.
Probably a bit of a dramatic flourish.
Yeah, probably. But what he really criticized was how the scholastics were interpreting Aristotle. He thought the original texts had been messed up over time and that the commentators had made things way too complicated. He even said maybe Aristotle purposely made his ideas hard to understand just for his inner circle.
Like a secret code for philosophers.
Right. And what's interesting for a philosopher is how Ramus saw Aristotle, not as the ultimate authority like the scholastics, but as a philosopher more like Socrates, aligned with Cicero. And he saw the scholastic Aristotelians as, like, fakes.
Yeah, pretenders to the throne of knowledge.
Totally. And this difference of opinion comes out in his debate with Jacob Scheck, a big defender of Aristotle. They exchanged letters, and Ramus even wrote this whole book, Defensio pro Aristoteli adversus Jacobus Geschium. Basically, they disagreed about what logic even is, what it's for, and how it works. The Aristotelians saw the different parts of the organon as dealing with different aspects of logic, like whether an argument is probably true or definitely true. Okay, so they were fighting over the fundamentals.
Yeah, the very foundation of knowledge.
And Ramus went on to challenge the classic Aristotelian definition of philosophy. Aristotle saw it as an intellectual disposition focused on being, divided into theoretical and practical parts.
Yeah, habitus intellectualis, I think it's called.
Right. But Ramus said logic wasn't just a tool for philosophy. It was a part of philosophy itself. He defined it as the art of correct discourse or analysis, ars bene discerendi. And for Ramus, this basically made metaphysics unnecessary.
Whoa, so he was really shaking things up, and this is where the Stoics come in, right?
You got it. Ramus was super into the Stoic idea that the universe is rationally ordered and that reflects human reason. He liked their idea that art and nature are connected and that logic is essential to philosophy. His own definition of philosophy was the knowledge of the liberal arts, cognitio artium liberalium. You can see the Stoic and medieval influences there. For Ramus, logic was how we learn about being, sometimes even described as a collection of precepts, comprehensio preceptorum. He was really focused on how we teach and learn.
And that's what makes him so interesting. He's bridging these different traditions and making it all about education.
Totally. And his view of Aristotle can seem confusing. Sometimes he's like, I'm the true Aristotelian, and other times he's trashing the whole scholastic tradition.
Yeah, like make up your mind, dude.
Right. But it seems like he was just being strategic, using different approaches depending on who he was arguing with. He definitely engaged with Aristotle's ideas, but Cicero and the Stoics were huge influences too. And it's funny, he rarely attacked Aristotle directly, usually blaming his interpreters for messing things up.
It's like he was saying Aristotle was cool, but his fan club ruined everything.
Exactly. And then we have his famous 3 laws of philosophy.
Oh yeah, those are classic Ramus.
The first one is the lex veritatis, the law of truth, which is all about general principles and how important they are. Then there's the lex justitiae, the law of justice, which is basically saying each discipline should stay in its lane and not mix things up. That's actually why he was against Copernicus, because Copernicus was combining math and physics. And finally, there's the lex sapientiae, the law of wisdom, which says knowledge should be organized from general to specific.
So like a pyramid of knowledge with the big ideas at the top and the details at the bottom.
Right. And these laws show how much Ramus wanted to make knowledge organized and structured. Our source even calls it putting a military discipline on nature. It led his followers to see philosophy as a methodical collection, collectio methodica, and he even rejected metaphysics as a separate field.
Whoa, that's a big move. No more metaphysics.
Nope, not for Ramus. And then there's the question of whether Plato influenced him. Some people called him the French Plato, Plato Gallicus. But it seems like that was more about strategy than deep philosophical agreement.
Yeah, like he was using Plato to poke at the Aristotelians.
Exactly. Cicero and the Stoics were the real deal for him. But his relationship to the scholastic tradition is complicated. He definitely built on it, even if he transformed it. And that's something scholars are still trying to figure out.
It's like a tangled family tree of ideas.
Totally. Now let's get into Ramus's ideas on logic and method. He thought this was super important, like the heart of discourse. We talk about how he defined logic as ars bene discerendi, the art of correct discourse, and saw it as part of philosophy itself. That meant metaphysics wasn't needed.
He was streamlining the whole system.
Yep, and he was really critical of this old logic textbook, the Sumili Logicalis.
Oh yeah, that one by Petrus Hispanus.
That's the one. Ramus thought it was totally useless, even though it actually influenced his own ideas on logic. And we can't forget about Cicero's role in all this. He was a big influence on humanist logic at the time.
Cicero was like the OG logic influencer.
Haha, yeah, kind of. So Ramus looked at Aristotle's organon, focusing on the categories, which deals with what kinds of things exist, the analytics, which is about scientific conclusions, and the topics, which is about arguing different sides of an issue. But when it came to inventio, finding arguments, he leaned on the Stoics and Cicero. He liked Cicero's idea of ratio discerendi, the art of discourse, instead of Aristotle's inveniendi, the art of invention. This shift emphasized finding good arguments first, instead of making judgments first. But the Aristotelians weren't happy about this. They thought it was more about persuasion than truth.
So it was like a debate about how to debate.
Exactly. Now, Ramus also added aedicium, judgment, as the second key part of logic. It didn't get as much attention as inventio in his writings, but it was still controversial. He divided it in different ways, first into syllogisms, method, and ideas, which he later dropped, and then into axiomaticum, organizing arguments into propositions, and dianolicum, which included syllogisms and method.
Okay, so he kept refining his system.
Yeah, he was always tweaking things. And he had this interesting idea about syllogisms, those logical arguments with premises and conclusions. He accepted the syllogismus expositorius, which is a syllogism about a specific individual, like Socrates is mortal instead of all men are mortal. This shows how he thought logic could be applied to the humanities, like history and literature, where you're dealing with unique individuals and situations. For him, logic was about organizing arguments, not necessarily discovering new knowledge.
So more about making sense of what we already know.
Right. And then there's method, which was huge for Ramus. In the 16th century, people were arguing about what Aristotle meant by method. Was it about discovering new knowledge or organizing what we already know? Ramus claimed he was following Aristotle, but he understood it differently from other Aristotelians.
So another case of I'm the true Aristotelian.
Yeah, pretty much. And discussions about method went beyond just Aristotle. People were looking at medicine and geometry too. They were talking about analysis, breaking things down, and synthesis, putting things together. They were also distinguishing between methodus, the actual procedure, and ordo, how you teach something.
Like the difference between doing science and teaching science.
Exactly. They were also talking about natural versus artificial methods and the idea of moving from general principles to specific examples and vice versa. But Ramus was super strict about method. He said there was only one true method and no real difference between methodus and ordo. He even said that what's obvious to us, nocior nobis, has to be the same as what's fundamental in nature, notior naturae.
So what we see first is what's most important.
Right, like when you see an animal in the distance, you see its general shape first, then the details. He applied this to logic, saying the natural order is argument, proposition, syllogism. And he thought other fields should follow the same pattern. Like in medicine, you should start with the whole body and then look at the parts. For Ramus, method wasn't just one way of doing things, it was the only right way. The diagrams and tables he used in his books, they were just ways of showing this natural order. He even used the word dispositio, arrangement, for iudicium, judgment, to emphasize how important order was.
So it's all about structure, structure, structure.
Yeah, pretty much. But applying this rigid method to the humanities was tricky. He said poets like Virgil and Horace followed it, but then admitted they broke the rules sometimes for artistic reasons. He even had this idea of methodus prudentiae, a method of practical wisdom, but got rid of it because it was confusing. Later, he called it a secondary illustration of method, methodi secunda illustratio.
Okay, so he was flexible, but only a little bit.
Yeah, just a smidge. Now, when it comes to how we learn, Ramus mostly accepted Aristotle's ideas. We learn through our senses, we observe things, we figure out cause and effect, and then we apply that knowledge through experience. Like, use the example of getting drunk from wine.
Ah, the classic philosophical example.
Right, but he stressed that every field has three parts. Its nature, its principles, and its practical application, exertatio. He thought practice was essential, not just to see if something works, but also to show its value. He saw these three parts as connected, and even though he was all about the natural method, he knew that in practice you couldn't always go from general to specific. Sometimes you need to analyze, break things down, and synthesize, put things together.
So it's not just a one-way street.
Nope. And he thought the best way to learn logic was by doing it. He had students analyze texts, like speeches and poems, to see how the logical principles worked. They would identify the main point, break down the arguments, and use inventio and edicium to figure out the propositions and syllogisms. Then they would try to create their own arguments and texts, which he called genesis. This was all about showing they understood the theory by applying it.
Learning by doing, that's a timeless principle.
Totally. And this approach was for everything, not just logic. He had students studying classic texts like Aristotle's physics and Pliny's natural history, focusing on the ancients instead of doing their own experiments. This shows his curriculum was aimed at humanities students and those going into professions where language and communication were key. He was basically preparing students for a new world with new jobs.
He was ahead of his time in that way.
He was. And there's this story about how he got in trouble for bringing ancient orators into other subjects. The university had strict rules about what you could teach where.
Academia can be so rigid sometimes.
Tell me about it. But Ramus made a distinction between how you organize knowledge in a textbook and how you use it in real life. He said you might have to keep things separate in a book, but in practice you combine them to get things done. His friend Nancilius says that the exercises they did at Ramus's college actually produced better orators. It shows how his integrated approach worked. He wasn't a fan of learning one thing at a time in isolation.
He wanted to shake things up, break down the walls between subjects.
Yeah, he was a disruptor. Now, his way of organizing knowledge had big consequences. We already talked about how he got rid of metaphysics. He also redefined rhetoric, limiting it to style and delivery, while giving inventio and idicium to dialectic. And he even got rid of memoria, memory, as a separate art. He thought if knowledge is organized properly, it should be easy to remember.
So no more memorizing long lists of facts.
Not in Ramus's world. And all of this was about making education more efficient and cutting down the time it took to get a degree. He even wanted to include practical math, like mechanics. He criticized the ancient Greeks for being too focused on abstract math, calling out Euclid and even Archimedes for not caring enough about practical applications. He loved how Nuremberg supported the mechanical arts, which he saw as more forward-thinking.
He was all about what works, what's useful.
Totally. Now let's talk about Ramus's views on intellectual freedom. Some people thought he was a skeptic, academicus, who taught his students to doubt everything. But he denied that.
Skepticism was a pretty hot topic back then.
It was. But Ramus's main beef with the scholastics was that they blindly followed Aristotle. He thought they valued authority over reason and were being true Aristotelians. He said Aristotle himself questioned things, even challenging his own teacher Plato. And he thought logic should be about debating both sides of an issue. He blamed Aristotle's interpreters for stifling this kind of open inquiry.
So he's saying, don't just take Aristotle's word for it, think for yourselves.
Exactly. And he was a fan of Aristotle's method in the Topics, where you argue both sides of an issue. In Utrumque partem dicere, he thought this led to accepting probabilities instead of being certain about everything.
Which can be dangerous, right? Thinking you have all the answers.
For sure. And even though skepticism was making a comeback at the time, Ramus preferred eclecticism. He liked Galen, who took good ideas from different schools of thought.
Picking and choosing the best bits.
Yep. And he explained that academicide the skeptics were just eclectics. They were different from other philosophers, like free people are different from slaves. They were independent thinkers. Ramus wanted to be a free philosopher, not a slave to any one authority. He believed in reason and thought that thinking critically wasn't dangerous because true reason couldn't be wrong. The real danger was accepting other people's opinions without thinking.
So he's basically saying, don't be a sheep, use your brain.
Exactly. But this created a problem for his own followers. How could they follow Ramus without being accused of blindly following an authority?
It's a paradox.
It is. Ramus knew this and looked up to Socrates as a model of someone who encouraged independent thinking. His followers even called themselves Socratics instead of Ramists.
Clever way to avoid the label.
It was. But this freedom had limits. Neither Ramus nor his followers questioned religious dogma. They were still bound by certain restrictions.
So freedom, but within certain boundaries.
Right. Now let's talk about the legacy of Ramism. Was it useful? Did it last?
The critics called him usurarius, or usurarius, which basically meant he was stealing ideas and getting rich off them. But his friend, Nancilius, said he was actually pretty modest financially.
The humanists were all about useful knowledge and thought the scholastics were teaching useless stuff. Ramus made fun of rote memorization, like learning the grammatically incorrect phrase ego berat. He wanted to make education practical, and that's why he's considered important in the history of pedagogy. He even got the nickname Paginarius because he annotated texts page by page. He was a real innovator in education.
A true reformer.
Yeah, and his ideas appealed to people outside the universities, like kings and rulers who needed educated officials. And as a humanist, he promoted the humanities. He even wanted to publish an edition of Cicero's speeches. He was a great speaker himself, and he tried to make logic and rhetoric relevant to every field.
He wanted to make learning useful for everyone.
Exactly. Now, Ramus might not be a famous philosopher today, but his goal wasn't to come up with some mind-blowing new theory. He wanted to change how universities taught things. He was like a pioneer of teaching methods, even if he wasn't as original as someone like Comenius. There's this story about how people accused him of bringing poetry and speeches into the classroom, but his friend Nancilius defended him, saying those things weren't just about good speaking. They were full of philosophical ideas about ethics, rhetoric, and logic.
So he was using literature to teach philosophy.
Yeah, he was pretty creative. And Ramism spread not because it was groundbreaking philosophy, but because it was practical and met the needs of the time. It worked well for Protestant theologians who used the loci method of commonplaces. People even tried to combine Ramus's ideas with Melanchthon's theology. His emphasis on the humanities and his opposition to the scholastics and Aristotle, even though sometimes they misunderstood him, appealed to all sorts of people. And his focus on usefulness changed the way people thought about learning.
He really shifted the focus of practicality.
He did. And modern scholars are still debating Ramus's legacy. Some, like Bruyère and Ravenet, think he was a legit philosopher with a Platonic view of reality, maybe even influenced by his religious beliefs. Others are still trying to figure out if he developed his own religious metaphysics after becoming Protestant. And the reasons for his murder are still debated.
A real mystery.
It is. Some scholars connect his ideas to older debates, like the one between nominalists and realists, and to thinkers like Aquinas, Scotus, and Occam. His emphasis on one true method has led some to look for deeper influences, like Platonism, Loism, and Christian humanism. But some, like Berthoud, saw him as dangerous, even associating him with atheism.
So even centuries later, he's still causing controversy.
Yeah, he's a real enigma. But nowadays, scholars are less interested in just analyzing his writings and more interested in tracing his influence. They're looking at what his followers did and the historical context of his ideas. His impact on education, especially in smaller schools, was huge. He helped set up schools in towns and cities that didn't have big universities. But some humanists, like Justus Lipsius, weren't fans. They thought his curriculum was too simplified and didn't like that he relied on textbooks. And ironically, the 30 Years' War actually made his textbooks more popular because people needed to rebuild their education systems.
War can have strange effects on intellectual trends.
It can. And while Ramus wasn't tied to a specific religious group at first, when his ideas were used in Reformed theology, some Lutheran theologians went back to Aristotle. This resistance changed how his ideas were received. People tried to combine them with Aristotle, like Keckerman, who came up with methodical peripateticism.
So a sort of hybrid approach.
Exactly. And Ramus's influence is also seen in the rise of encyclopedias, like Alsted's Cursus Philosophicae Encyclopedia, which was inspired by Keckerman. And later, people like Comenius followed suit. It's hard to categorize Ramus's followers. They were all over the place, and scholars use terms like Ramist, semi-Ramist, and Philippo-Ramist to describe them. Neil Gilbert Wilson even suggested looking at the structure of logic books to see if they follow Aristotle's static logic or Ramus's more dynamic logic. Scholars are also studying how Ramus's ideas were adopted and adapted in different places and how people reacted to his textbooks. And there's growing interest in his influence on literature. His dialectic was translated into various languages, including French, and there might be connections to the Pléiade literary movement in Paris, though the evidence is thin. And people like Tuve have studied how rhetoric textbooks, including Ramus's, influenced how writers used imagery. But there's still debate about his overall impact on literature and the humanities. Some, like Grafton and Jardine, think he moved away from humanism towards practicality. Others, like Henderson, think he wanted to bring rhetoric and philosophy together. And Charade thinks he lacked literary sensibility and might have even hurt the humanities in England.
So a mixed bag, but definitely a lasting impact.
Yeah, he wasn't perfect, but he definitely made a difference. So to wrap it all up, Petrus Ramus might not be a superstar philosopher today, but he was a big deal in his time. His most important contribution was probably his ideas about education and his willingness to challenge authority. He was all about making knowledge useful and accessible, and that resonated with the changes happening in the world around him.
And for you, the philosophy enthusiast, Ramus's story is a great example of how intellectual movements work, the push and pull between old and new ideas, and the eternal questions about what knowledge is for and who should have access to it.
So here's something to think about. How is Ramus's desire to reform education similar to the challenges we face today? What are the scholasticisms of our time, the rigid ways of thinking we need to break free from? And who are the modern-day Ramuses trying to change how we learn and understand the world? This deep dive into Ramus's life and work gives us a new perspective on our own intellectual landscape.
It's a reminder that the quest for knowledge and the struggle to make it accessible are ongoing. And it makes you wonder, who are the unsung heroes of our time who are pushing the boundaries and shaping the future of thought?
Yeah, and are we paying attention? Or are we stuck in our own versions of scholasticism?
Food for thought, indeed.
Absolutely.